For those who live in Lund, Stadsparken is a key part of the urban landscape, but in spite of the great age of the city, the park is only a little over 100 years old. It was built in its modern form to host the 1907 exhibition, often called Lundautställningen, meaning that even though this exhibition ended well over 100 years ago, it still profoundly affects the city. This was a place to showcase the new products of industry, art pieces by local artists, and the modernity and beauty of the city. The exhibition in Lund was far from unique. This was a time when many novelties and innovations became available all over the world, but also a time when mass media was in a much earlier state of development. The exhibitions were important marketing tools. They were perhaps the largest gathering of people at the time, meaning that your product could be shown to perhaps millions. There were also important symbols of national, regional, and local pride. As long-range travel became ever more convenient, crowds could be drawn from far and wide, and this was an opportunity for politicians to showcase their nation, region, or city. While exhibitions had existed in different forms for a long time, the phenomenon became incredibly popular in 1851, when Albert, Prince Consort of the United Kingdom, organized a great exhibition in Hyde Park in a vast building of glass and steel, which was named the Crystal Palace. London repeated this success in 1862, in the building that is now the Natural History Museum. This success inspired other cities around the world to follow suit, and just like in the United Kingdom, they would attempt to host them in the most impressive venues they could build. Paris would host its first exhibition in 1855, and would host massively successful exhibitions in 1889 and 1900. The 1889 exhibition would see the construction of the Eiffel Tower, at the time the tallest structure ever built by a wide margin. Vienna hosted in 1873, and the United States would also become a leading host, with Philadelphia hosting in 1876, Chicago in 1893, and St. Louis in 1904. Sweden would also come to host several fairs. Stockholm hosted a national exhibition in 1897, and many smaller cities would also host exhibitions of various scales. In 1906, for instance, the city of Norrköping had held an exhibition of slightly larger size than Lundautställningen. The exhibition in Lund had in fact been delayed by a year to avoid competing with Norrköping. 7 years after the exhibition in Lund, neighboring Malmö would host Baltiska utställningen in what would come to be called Pildammsparken, perhaps the most beautiful of the city's parks. The 1907 exhibition was organized by Fabriks- och Hantverksföreningen i Lund, or the Factory and Crafts Association in Lund. In 1895, it had hosted a local exhibition on a much smaller scale, but it now wanted to showcase the city on a grander stage. The chairman of the board of this organization was Axel Andersson. He was the son of a non-commissioned officer and had worked himself up from upholstering furniture to heading the board of the local trade organization. Later in life, he would find further success as the director of the local industrial brewery. He would also sit on the board of the exhibition itself. Local liberal newspaper director Valdemar Bylov would become secretary of the board. The architect for the event was the cathedral architect, at this time a prestigious position in the city of Lund. At this time, that office was held by Theodor Wåhlin, who was prolific in both sacral and secular architecture, especially in Scania, where he held his position. As no space of appropriate size existed in the city, park architect Johannes Ekberg was hired to design a new park to the south of the existing ones. This facility now makes up the majority of the city park. The chairman of the board was Robert Eklund, registrar at the university. At this time, photography was becoming increasingly practical, and the exhibition was fairly extensively photographed. Per Bagge was chosen as the official photographer of the event. He ran the old studio of Lina Jon, a female photographer who had achieved such renown that Per Bagge still used her name for the studio. The early 20th century saw a great number of architectural styles, and many were present at the exhibition. Historicism was still in vogue to some degree, and some pavilions imitated historic style, both the local vernacular one and more far-flung ones, like Holländska Kafferosteriets pavilion in Moorish revival. Theodor Wåhlin sometimes worked in Art Nouveau, or Jugendstil, as it is known locally, and the large exhibition halls followed this style. Nationalromantik is also represented among the buildings of the exhibition, a mostly Nordic variant of Art Nouveau, characterized by darker tones and influence from Gothic and Romanesque architecture to give the buildings a medieval feel. The largest and most spectacular building of the fair was Industrihallen, or the Hall of Industry. At 6,500 square meters in area and 165 meters in length, it was significantly larger than the old cathedral. The building also included a 45-meter tower built out of wood. Observation platforms were a common occurrence at exhibitions, with the Eiffel Tower and the original Ferris wheel in Chicago serving as examples. A wooden tower twice as high as the one in Lund would also be built in Malmö 7 years later. For a small fee, visitors could climb up the tower and see a panoramic view of the city, at this point still mostly contained within the medieval perimeter, and of the surrounding plains. As anyone who lives in Lund knows, 45 meters is plenty enough to get beautiful views of Malmö and to be able to make out Copenhagen in the distance. The hall was partly used to exhibit products of industry, of course, but products made by skilled craftsmen were also showcased, such as furniture, instruments, and photographs, at this point still not considered art pieces. Next to the industry hall stood the art hall, another one of the large Art Nouveau structures designed by Volin. Here hundreds of paintings and sculptures were shown, among others by artist Hilma af Klint. On the other side of the exhibition grounds stood Maskinhallen, or the Hall of Machinery. Here products of heavy industry were displayed on an area of 2,650 square meters. This was a time of industrialization on a massive scale. The factories of the world turned out an ever greater range and number of products, and the planet was rapidly shrinking as ever larger and faster machines were connecting the world. The ocean liner, steam locomotive, bicycle, telegraph, and telephone had rapidly changed the way people lived and made the world significantly more interconnected. The southern main line ran just outside the exhibition grounds, at this point already 50 years old. This was also the early days of electrification, and in the middle of the grounds, close to where the music pavilion now stands, a small power plant was built. It looked nothing like the characteristic power plant. Instead, it was designed in the same style as the other major buildings of the exhibition. It was designed by ASEA, a major industrial company in Sweden during the 20th century, which today survives as the A in ABB. It was built by Holmbergs mekaniska verkstad, at the time one of the largest industries in the city. The CEO of the company also served on the board of the exhibition. This showcased both ASEA and Holmbergs mekaniska verkstad, as well as providing power for the electrical lights all over the grounds. For many companies, running stalls in the main halls did not suffice. The grounds were full of smaller pavilions, often with bolder designs than the larger buildings. The strangest of them was a gigantic gnome sitting on the roof of the pavilion of Pellerin, a company selling margarine. Holländska Kafferosteriet had a pavilion in Moorish revival, while Malmö Kafferosteri had a pavilion built in a Javanese style. Colonial theming was common during exhibitions, although more so during larger fairs, especially in countries with extensive colonies themselves. Helsingborgs Ångtegelbruk built a scale model of Kärnan, the keep of the medieval castle in Helsingborg, which still stands today. While it was a scale model, it was still of considerable size. The chocolate manufacturer Massetti also had a distinct pavilion with large round windows. The lighting company Lux made their pavilion in the shape of a massive lantern. The second half of the long 19th century was a period of intense urbanization in Sweden, and a great number of apartment buildings were built across the country. While these are now desirable real estate, the conditions at the time were more often than not unsanitary and cramped. There were also anxieties about what would happen to the social fabric of society when people no longer had their own houses. A movement therefore emerged which sought to build affordable single-family homes so that urban workers could also own their own accommodation. This movement came to be known as Egnahemsrörelsen, or the Own Home movement. The late 19th century was also the age of social movements in Sweden. As part of this movement, 2 model villas were built for the exhibition, envisioning the future of housing. Theodor Volin designed one, in a style which looks back to traditional rural architecture, but there was also one called Solidarvillan. It was relatively small and built in a national romantic style, but the interior was bright, with large windows. The design prioritized hygiene, and it included features such as a separate kitchen area and washing area, as well as a space to hang up bedding during the day. In spite of its relatively humble size, it was still criticized for being out of reach for the poor. This story reminds us of the vast inequality of Swedish society at the time. Not only was economic inequality great, but Sweden was far from democratic. While the time of absolute monarchy was long gone, parliamentarism was in its infancy in the country, and male suffrage was neither universal nor equal. Female suffrage was also 14 years away. The secretary of the exhibition, who would later write about it, was a liberal newspaper owner that called for liberal reform. At this time, liberals were also far from the only group calling for reform. The Social Democratic Party was an increasingly present political force, and 2 years after the exhibition, they organized a nationwide strike. The exhibitions of this time were also places of competition and entertainment. A jury would judge companies in different categories and give out prizes in gold, silver, and bronze to the manufacturers who were deemed to be the best. Companies would boast about the results of these competitions, just like they might today about getting a good review in a consumer test or having a high average score on a review aggregator. There were also competitions meant more for entertainment. During this time, the Olympic Games were intricately linked to the World's Fairs, with the 1900 Games occurring in Paris and the 1904 Games in St. Louis concurrently with the World's Fairs at the same locations. While the Olympics were of course not hosted in Lund, the fair did organize a folk music competition. Folk musicians from all over the country, but especially from Scania, traveled to Lund. The ranges ranged from children to men in their 80s, and the competition was a real crowd pleaser. There were also more purely entertainment-focused parts of the event. Just outside of the grounds, close to Andelsmejeriet, whose buildings are now a venue for theater and music, a small amusement park was built to attract visitors from the main exhibitions. Here, a massive circular slide was built, and a small menagerie showcased monkeys among other animals. Visitors could also make a visit to a cinema, at the time a rather new invention. There were several options for those who were hungry at the exhibition. The most exclusive one was huvudrestaurangen, or the main restaurant, designed to resemble a traditional South Swedish inn. Here, elaborate multi-course dinners were served with esteemed guests, including ministers and princes. Conservative Civil Service Minister Julius Julin was present at the inauguration, and, in August, Crown Prince Gustav attended the event. Later that same year, he would inherit the throne. He would be the last king to attempt to exercise his constitutional powers during the early part of his reign, but would later accept the advent of Swedish democracy and would remain king until 1950. He was succeeded by his son, Gustav Adolf, who was a patron of the exhibition in Lund and would visit 2 weeks after his father. Together, they reigned for nearly 70 years. In the higher price range, there was also a bar meant to resemble those in Britain and the United States. If these options were not within your price range, you could visit automatrestaurangen, so called because of the self-service concept, something which was very rare at the time. Several pavilions that sold food-related products, such as the brewery and the margarine factory, also sold sandwiches or crackers at an even cheaper rate. The main restaurant also saw an event which would be reported on with outrage by newspapers all over the country. During a pleasant evening with a group of Danish guests, the restaurateur had lowered the Swedish flag and raised the Danish one in the spirit of Scandinavianism, an ideology seeking for the cultural and sometimes political unification of Scandinavia. This was a movement that had seen its peak a few decades earlier during the mid-19th century. It can perhaps be compared to the unification movements of Germany and Italy. By the late 19th century, however, Scandinavianism had taken several blows. This all meant that the conservative press were thoroughly unimpressed by the stunt with the Danish flag, and this issue loomed large in the newspaper coverage of the exhibition. Close to the main restaurant, the entrance and exit of the exhibition stood, designed to resemble the gatehouse on the coat of arms of Lund, in spite of the fact that a gatehouse like that never really existed. Outside of the exhibition, the visitors would find a rather small city of 19,000 people. Here, everyday life carried on as normal, and soon the same would apply to the exhibition grounds. The fair lasted from May 30th to September 22nd and attracted over 200,000 visitors. This number was achieved in spite of the cold and rainy weather, which had somewhat put a damper on the festivities. A planned garden exhibition was even cancelled due to gardens not growing properly. However, this impressive statistic may be slightly less so when you consider that Paris had around 50 million visitors in 1900. That being said, for a city the size of Lund, it was a genuinely impressive figure. While Lundautställningen was only average in size from a Swedish point of view and insignificant in an international context, it still made Lund part of a global phenomenon started 50 years earlier at the Crystal Palace. Like so much of the tail end of the long 19th century, Lundautställningen now seems like the swan song of a society about to be pulled into the maelstrom of modern warfare. While the exhibitions would return during the interwar years with full force, and would even see a last resurgence during the post-war decades, the world of Moorish revival pavilions and top hats was irrevocably lost, for better and for worse. When Gothenburg held its exhibition in 1923, the more restrained styles of Art Deco and Nordic Classicism were in vogue, and when Stockholm held a World's Fair during the Great Depression, it was the introduction of modernist architecture to Sweden. The world no longer had room for great Art Nouveau halls or gigantic margarine gnomes. Today, not much remains of the exhibition except for the park itself. Only the music pavilion survived the exhibition, moved to a more central location in the park. When the playground was remodeled in 2014 and 15, models of some of the pavilions were built, although strangely not the gnome, a favorite among children in its day. Today, the children climb on models of the Industry Hall Tower, the Lux Pavilion shaped like a lantern, and the three-towered gatehouse. This video is part of the Axel Andersson project. It is run by history students at Lund University in cooperation with Kulturen, in a wider project that seeks to educate about forgotten figures in the cultural history of Lund.